Hello, dear viewers, and welcome back to Life Story 999. Today, we have an astonishing tale that will make you ponder the true essence of justice, humility, and how our past often finds a way to revisit us in the most unexpected moments. As you listen, try to put yourself in this scenario. What would you do if you were in their shoes? We encourage you to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this one. And if you have a similar experience, we'd love to hear about it in the comments or through email. The early morning sunlight streamed through the towering courthouse windows in Washington, D.C., casting a warm glow over the bustling activity within. Sarah Bennett, a 52-year-old professor, adjusted her navy blazer and tightened her grip on her leather briefcase. Her presence exuded confidence, the kind earned from over 2 decades of teaching constitutional law at Georgetown University Law Center. Today, however, was different. Instead of her familiar classroom filled with eager law students, Sarah found herself in traffic court, contesting a seemingly minor parking violation. The courthouse was alive with its usual energy. Clerks hurriedly shuffled papers, security guards nodded to familiar faces, and nervous defendants whispered to their attorneys. Seated quietly at the back, Sarah took in her surroundings. She watched as some individuals were greeted warmly, while others received nothing more than an indifferent glance. She noticed how some defendants were allowed to speak freely, while others were swiftly cut off mid-sentence. Sarah was more than just an observer. She was a distinguished professor, one who had shaped the minds of countless legal professionals, including some who now presided in these very courtrooms. When Sarah's name was finally called, she stood up gracefully, her demeanor calm and collected. Judge Michael Harrison barely looked up from his paperwork as he announced her case, his voice stern and authoritative. At 35, Judge Harrison was one of the youngest judges in Washington, D.C., with a reputation for his strict demeanor and no-nonsense approach. He took pride in maintaining order in his courtroom and was known for being particularly unforgiving, especially when it came to minor traffic infractions involving minority defendants. Judge Harrison didn't recognize Sarah's name, nor did he realize the significance of the person standing before him. To him, this was just another mundane case, a simple parking infraction that didn't warrant his full attention. As Sarah presented her argument, explaining the confusion caused by unclear signage, Harrison interrupted her almost immediately, his tone growing impatient. He dismissed her explanation without much thought, and Sarah, maintaining her composure, attempted once more to clarify how the signage had been obstructed. But once again, Harrison cut her off, issuing a $500 fine, an unusually harsh penalty for such a minor offense. A hushed silence settled over the courtroom as the judge's words echoed through the space. The steep fine surprised even the regulars present, who exchanged uneasy glances. Yet Sarah remained calm, her expression unchanged. She nodded and, with a hint of something more in her voice, said, "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll be sure to finish grading my students' papers early this afternoon. Something you might remember from your time in my constitutional law class at Georgetown 10 years ago." The silence deepened as the realization struck Judge Harrison. His pen paused mid-motion, and his stern expression softened into one of shock. Slowly, he looked up, really seeing the woman in front of him for the first time. Professor Sarah Bennett, his former mentor, the very person who had taught him the foundations of justice, fairness, and humility, was standing there as the defendant he had just treated so dismissively. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as people began to make the connection. Judge Harrison's face went pale, and for the first time that day, he felt the weight of his actions bearing down on him.
In the moments that followed, Judge Michael Harrison struggled to regain his composure. The confident, authoritative demeanor that had always defined him in the courtroom now felt like a fragile mask, one that had just been shattered by the presence of Professor Sarah Bennett. Memories came flooding back, her lectures on fairness, equality, and the deep importance of empathy in the practice of law. She had taught him that the role of a judge was not merely to enforce the law but to understand the people behind each case. She had written the glowing recommendation that had paved his way to this very judicial appointment. And now, she was the one he had treated with impatience, without even giving her a fair chance to explain. Harrison felt a wave of shame wash over him. His mind replayed every dismissive word he had spoken to her, the moments he had cut her off mid-sentence, The way he had handed down that steep $500 fine as if she were just another case number in the docket. He remembered her calm face, the way she had addressed him. There was no malice in her voice, just a quiet reminder of who she was and who he used to be. She had always emphasized that the law should serve everyone equally, without bias, and here he was, failing her and himself. Judge Harrison paused the proceedings abruptly, his voice breaking slightly as he announced a 10-minute recess. There was a murmur of surprise throughout the courtroom. It wasn't like Harrison to call a recess, especially not during a simple traffic case. He stood up quickly, avoiding eye contact with Sarah, and walked briskly to his chambers, his robe billowing behind him like a storm cloud. Once inside his chambers, Harrison loosened his collar, feeling the tension in his throat ease just slightly. He sank heavily into his leather chair, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He stared blankly at the polished wood of his desk, his thoughts a chaotic mess of regret and embarrassment. How could he have been so blind? How could he have failed to recognize the person who had once inspired him to take the path of justice? His eyes drifted to the bottom drawer of his desk. Almost without thinking, he pulled it open and reached for an old yearbook from his days at Georgetown Law. The edges were worn from years of being handled, and as he flipped through the pages, he found her, Professor Bennett, smiling confidently alongside the other faculty members. Her eyes seemed to look straight at him, as if reminding him of everything she had once taught him. Harrison traced his finger over her picture, his mind filled with memories of those years. He remembered the way she had challenged him and his classmates to confront their own biases, to see beyond the surface and understand the complexities of the human condition. She had always pushed them to ask themselves tough questions, questions about justice, equality, and their own preconceptions. She had made him want to be a better person, a better lawyer, and eventually, a better judge. But today, he had failed her. He closed the yearbook and let out a deep sigh. The weight of his role had never felt as heavy as it did now. He realized that somewhere along the way, in the pursuit of authority and efficiency, he had lost sight of the fundamental principles that Professor Bennett had instilled in him. He had become so focused on maintaining order and control that he had forgotten the humanity behind each case, the very humanity that Sarah had always emphasized. Harrison leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He knew he couldn't change what had happened, but he also knew that this was a moment of reckoning. It was a chance for him to reflect, to grow, and to become the judge that his mentor had always believed he could be. He couldn't undo the harsh words or the dismissive tone, but he could make it right, starting now. After a few moments, he stood up, straightening his robes and taking a deep breath. He looked at his reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall. His face, usually so stern and composed, now showed vulnerability. He saw not just a judge but a man who had made a mistake, a man who needed to do better. It was time to face the courtroom again, but this time, he would face it with humility. As he walked back toward the courtroom, Harrison felt a sense of determination settle within him. He had a responsibility, not just to uphold the law, but to uphold the ideals of justice that Professor Bennett had always stood for. He couldn't change the past, but he could change how he moved forward. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrison re-entered. He took his seat at the bench, his demeanor noticeably different, no longer the stern, unyielding judge, but someone who had been reminded of the core values that should guide every decision. He looked up, meeting Sarah's eyes for the first time since the recess had been called. There was no animosity in her gaze, only a calm patience that seemed to say she was waiting to see what he would do next. "Professor Bennett," Harrison began, his voice steady but softer than before, "I owe you and this court an apology." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. "My conduct this morning did not reflect the fairness and impartiality that I strive to uphold. I let my position cloud my judgment, and I failed to give you the respect you deserve." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I am dismissing your case, and I want to thank you for reminding me of what it truly means to serve justice." The courtroom was silent, the tension replaced by a sense of awe. Sarah nodded, her expression one of understanding rather than triumph. She had not come here to win a battle, but to let justice take its course, and in that moment, it seemed that perhaps it finally had. Judge Harrison turned to the rest of the courtroom. "Let this serve as a reminder to all of us," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "that the pursuit of justice requires humility, empathy, and the willingness to learn, even from our mistakes." It was a moment that would be remembered not just by those in the courtroom, but by Harrison himself, a turning point in his career, and perhaps in his life. As the proceedings resumed, the judge's approach was noticeably different. He listened more intently, asked more thoughtful questions, and treated each person before him with the respect they deserved. And though it was only the beginning, it was a step toward becoming the judge, and the person he had once aspired to be, thanks to the lessons of Professor Sarah Bennett. After the recess, Judge Harrison returned to the courtroom, and it was immediately evident that something had changed. Gone was the confident arrogance that had previously marked his demeanor, replaced instead by a somber humility. The judge's steps were slower, more deliberate, and his gaze, once distant and commanding, now reflected a vulnerability that no one in the courtroom had seen before. The room fell into an expectant silence, curious eyes fixed on the judge as he took his seat. Harrison took a deep breath, his gaze settling on Sarah Bennett, who sat calmly in her place, waiting. There was no tension in her posture, no smugness, only patience, a reminder of the kind of teacher she had always been. "Professor Bennett," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying a note of sincere regret that resonated through the room. "I owe you an apology." He paused, the weight of the words hanging heavily between them. "My conduct today did not reflect the fairness and impartiality that I swore to uphold when I took on this role. I let my own preconceptions cloud my judgment, and for that, I am deeply sorry." The courtroom, which had been buzzing with whispered conversations and speculation just moments earlier, fell into complete silence. The tension of expectation was replaced by an atmosphere of reflection. Judge Harrison's words hung in the air, their sincerity impossible to ignore. He continued, his voice more steady now. "I am dismissing your case, Professor Bennett, as it never should have come to this point. Furthermore, I want to take this moment to thank you." He looked directly at her, his eyes filled not with authority but with genuine respect. "You reminded me today of why I chose this profession in the first place, to serve justice, not to wield authority without empathy." Sarah nodded gently, her expression softening. There was no trace of triumph on her face, only an understanding that spoke to her years of experience as an educator. She stood, her voice calm but clear as she responded, "Thank you, Your Honor. The most important lessons in justice are often learned through experience, not lectures." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present, leaving them with an undeniable sense of the gravity of the moment. The courtroom remained still for a moment longer, as if collectively processing the exchange that had just taken place. What had started as an ordinary session had turned into a profound lesson on humility, the fallibility of those in power, and the courage it takes to admit when one is wrong. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, looking out over the courtroom, his expression more open and less guarded than it had been before. "Let this be a reminder to all of us," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke to the entire room, "that true justice is not about enforcing laws without question, but about understanding the people those laws are meant to serve. It requires empathy, humility, and the ability to recognize when we ourselves fall short." The words carried a weight that could be felt throughout the room, touching everyone from the clerks to the attorneys to the defendants waiting for their cases to be heard. The lawyers, who had once seen Judge Harrison as an unyielding figure, exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, acknowledging the significance of his transformation. Even the regular court officers stood a little straighter, sensing that they were witnessing a rare and important moment in the often impersonal world of the justice system. Sarah Bennett remained standing for a moment before returning to her seat. She knew that this was not just a lesson for Judge Harrison, but for everyone present. Justice was not merely about knowing the law, it was about applying it with understanding and a willingness to acknowledge one's own humanity. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her former student had taken a step toward becoming the kind of judge she had always believed he could be. As the proceedings resumed, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Judge Harrison, still visibly affected by the events that had just unfolded, handled each case with a new sense of attentiveness. He listened intently to each defendant, his demeanor calm and measured, his questions thoughtful. He treated each person before him with dignity, making sure they felt heard, regardless of the nature of their case. One by one, the cases were called, and slowly, the initial tension in the room began to ease. There was a newfound respect for the judge, a recognition that he was not infallible, but that he was willing to grow, to change, and to do better. The attorneys who had once feared his harsh judgments now saw in him a man who was willing to reflect on his actions and learn from his mistakes. Sarah watched from her seat, her heart swelling with a sense of pride she hadn't expected to feel. This was the kind of transformation she had always hoped to inspire in her students. Not just the mastery of the law, but the understanding of its purpose, to serve people, to be a beacon of fairness and hope, especially for those who had none. As the final case for the morning concluded, Judge Harrison looked over the courtroom once more. He had always believed that justice was about strength, about being firm and unwavering. But today, he had learned that true strength lay in vulnerability, in admitting when you were wrong, and in striving to be better. It was a lesson he would carry with him, not just in his professional life, but in every aspect of who he was. "Court is adjourned until this afternoon," Harrison announced, his voice steady, though softer than before. As people began to rise and gather their things, he glanced at Sarah once more, offering a small nod, a gesture of respect, of gratitude, and of acknowledgement. Sarah returned the nod, a quiet smile playing on her lips. As the courtroom emptied, the whispers resumed, but they were different now, less speculative, more reflective. People spoke not of a judge's mistake, but of his humility, of the rare moment they had witnessed when authority chose to kneel before justice. It was a day that many would remember, a day that reminded them all that, despite titles and robes, we are all human, capable of faltering, but also capable of growth. Sarah walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. She had not come here to teach a lesson, but life had a way of turning ordinary days into extraordinary opportunities for growth. And today, she knew, had been one of those days, not just for Michael Harrison, but for everyone who had watched him take that humbling yet transformative step forward. The remainder of the day's proceedings carried a noticeably different tone. Judge Harrison, clearly affected by the earlier events with Professor Bennett, exhibited a new kind of attentiveness that had not been present before. There was a quiet determination in his eyes, and his demeanor had shifted from one of detached authority to that of a careful listener. Each defendant received his full attention. He listened patiently, asked thoughtful questions, and approached every case with a fairness and empathy that had previously been absent from his courtroom. The atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed. Lawyers who had once felt the need to brace themselves before approaching the bench now felt the difference. They saw a judge who was willing to consider all perspectives, who was genuinely trying to understand the circumstances of each individual, not just the facts of the case. Defendants who had expected to be treated as just another number found themselves being treated with dignity. There was a sense that everyone mattered, that each voice would be heard. It was as though the courtroom itself had taken a deep breath, exhaled, and found a new sense of purpose. Word of the shift in Judge Harrison's demeanor quickly spread through the courthouse community. People spoke of the change. A once stern, unyielding judge had become someone who listened, who cared, and who sought to serve true justice rather than merely dispense orders. For Harrison, every decision he made after that day was informed by the memory of Professor Bennett and the humility that had washed over him in front of his mentor. He could not forget the way she had looked at him, not with anger or disappointment, but with patience, as if silently urging him to be better. 3 months later, Judge Harrison found himself once again at Georgetown Law, standing beside Professor Sarah Bennett at a seminar titled Justice and Bias in Modern Courtrooms. The lecture hall was filled to capacity, buzzing with energy as students, lawyers, and professors gathered, eager to hear about the intricacies of judicial bias and the lessons that could be learned from real-world experiences. The familiar sight of Georgetown's Grand Lecture Hall brought a mixture of nostalgia and nerves. But today, Harrison was not the student. He was the speaker, ready to share a deeply personal story. Sarah Bennett introduced him with a warm smile, her words filled with the kind of pride that only a mentor could feel. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from someone who has walked the path of learning and growth, not just in the classroom, but in life, she said, her eyes meeting Harrison's with encouragement. The room fell silent as Judge Harrison stepped forward, taking his place at the podium. He scanned the audience, seeing the curious, expectant faces of students who were much like he had once been, eager to learn, to challenge, to grow. "Good afternoon, everyone," Harrison began, his voice steady though tinged with emotion. "I'm here today to talk about something we all need to confront, bias. Not just in others, but in ourselves." He paused, his gaze softening as he continued. 3 months ago, I stood in my courtroom, presiding over what should have been a simple case, a parking violation. But that day turned into something far more profound, because I let my own biases get in the way of justice. The room was completely still, the audience hanging on to his every word. Harrison spoke candidly about that day, how he had dismissed Sarah Bennett's arguments without truly listening, how he had allowed his preconceived notions to cloud his judgment, and how he had failed to live up to the ideals he had once been so passionate about. He didn't shy away from the truth. He laid it bare, allowing the students to see his vulnerability, his humanity. Justice, Harrison said, is not just about applying the law, it's about understanding people and recognizing our own shortcomings. It's about humility. It's about realizing that even as judges, we are not above making mistakes, and that when we do, we must have the courage to face them, learn from them, and change. His voice was filled with sincerity, each word resonating deeply with those who listened. Sarah stood beside him, her expression one of pride and support. She had always taught her students that the law was not an abstract set of rules, but a living, breathing promise to serve humanity. Today, as she listened to Harrison, she knew that he had taken that lesson to heart in a way that would inspire not only the students before them but countless others who would hear his story. The students listened intently, many of them visibly moved by Harrison's honesty. They weren't hearing from a judge lecturing them about the technicalities of the law. They were hearing from a man who had been humbled by his own mistakes, a man who was willing to change in the face of his own failings. The vulnerability he displayed made him more relatable, more real. He wasn't just a figure in a black robe. He was someone who had once sat where they were, who had once dreamed of making a difference, and who had stumbled along the way but had the courage to get back up. After Harrison finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was genuine, heartfelt appreciation. The students were inspired, not just by his words, but by his actions, by his willingness to change. Harrison stepped back, allowing Sarah to take the podium once more. She smiled, her eyes shining with emotion as she addressed the audience. "The pursuit of justice is a journey," she said, her voice clear. "It's not about being perfect, it's about being willing to learn, to grow, and to admit when we are wrong. Judge Harrison has shown us that today, and I hope that each of you will take this lesson to heart as you move forward in your own careers." The seminar ended with a sense of hope and renewed purpose. The students filed out of the lecture hall, many of them approaching Harrison to thank him personally, to ask questions, to share their own thoughts on justice and bias. He listened to each one, his heart full, knowing that this was where change began, with honest conversations and the courage to face our own imperfections. As Harrison left Georgetown that day, he felt a sense of fulfillment that was different from anything he had experienced before. It wasn't the pride of winning a case or the satisfaction of maintaining order in his courtroom. It was the quiet, profound fulfillment of knowing that he was making a difference, not just as a judge, but as a human being. He knew that the path ahead would still have its challenges, but he was ready to face them, armed with the lessons he had learned, the humility he had gained, and the unwavering belief that true justice could only be achieved by those who were willing to look within. Sarah Bennett stood at the seminar podium, her presence commanding yet gentle, her words imbued with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades both observing and shaping the justice system. As she addressed the audience, her voice carried an undeniable authority, a voice that had experienced both the triumphs and the shortcomings of law, that understood the fragility of justice in the hands of imperfect people. "Bias is not always a malicious act," she began, her eyes sweeping across the room, meeting those of eager students, veteran lawyers, and even Judge Harrison, who sat in the front row. "Sometimes it is something subtle, something unconscious. It can be as simple as an assumption, a split-second judgment that colors our perception without us even realizing it. These biases are present in all of us, but as legal professionals, it is our duty to constantly challenge ourselves, to recognize our shortcomings, and strive to do better." The audience listened in rapt attention, many nodding as they absorbed her words. Sarah's demeanor was calm, her message direct. She didn't shy away from the truth, that bias existed everywhere, even within those who had taken oaths to uphold justice. And that the pursuit of justice wasn't about perfection, it was about growth, about striving every day to be better than the day before. She spoke of that day in traffic court, how a simple case had turned into a profound lesson not just for Judge Harrison, but for herself, for the court, and for everyone present. The story had since become a case study at Georgetown Law, used as a tool to teach future legal professionals about introspection, about fairness, and about the courage it took to admit when one was wrong. "The day in traffic court was not a failure," Sarah continued, her gaze briefly shifting to Judge Harrison, who watched her with an expression of deep respect. "It was a moment of learning, a moment of transformation. We, as judges, lawyers, and even as citizens, must understand that justice is a living, breathing ideal. It requires us to look inward, to reflect on our own actions, and to have the humility to change." She spoke about the concept of justice in a way that was both theoretical and deeply personal. She shared stories of her own time as a young lawyer, of moments where she too had made mistakes, where she had allowed her own biases to influence her actions. She told the audience about cases that had stayed with her, not because they were victories, but because they were lessons, reminders of the importance of empathy and understanding. One of the most poignant moments in her speech came when she spoke directly to the students in the audience. "You are the future of our legal system," she said, her voice softening. "And I want you to understand that your power as legal professionals will not come from the knowledge of statutes or the ability to recite precedents. It will come from your humanity, from your ability to understand the people you serve. Every person who stands before you, whether as a defendant, a client, or a colleague, has a story. It is your duty to listen, to see beyond the surface, and to ensure that the law serves not just as a tool of order, but as an instrument of justice." Her words resonated deeply with the students, who were eager to make their mark on the world. Many of them had entered law school with dreams of making a difference, and today they were reminded of what that difference truly meant. It wasn't about winning cases or impressing superiors. It was about ensuring that the law was fair, that every person had a voice, that justice was not merely a word, but a reality. The story of that day in traffic court became more than just a moment of embarrassment for Judge Harrison. It became a pivotal case study, a benchmark for the entire institution. Georgetown Law adopted it into their curriculum, using it as an example of the importance of self-awareness, fairness, and the courage it took to acknowledge and rectify one's own mistakes. Professors spoke about it in lectures, and students debated it in seminars, dissecting every moment to understand what went wrong, why it happened, and what could be done to prevent it in the future. Judge Harrison's reputation underwent a profound transformation. He was no longer seen as just the young, stern judge who presided over traffic court in Washington, D.C. He had become something far more meaningful, an example of how a person in power could change, could learn, and could grow. His humility in admitting his mistake, and his dedication to becoming a better judge, inspired not only those in his courtroom but also his peers and future generations of lawyers. Sarah's research paper, titled Justice in the Mirror, a study of judicial bias, quickly gained traction within the legal community. It was not merely an academic exercise. It was a call to action, a reminder that even those with the best intentions could falter, and that recognizing those moments of failure was the first step toward true justice. The paper was widely circulated, reaching law schools, judicial training programs, and bar associations across the country. It challenged judges and lawyers alike to look within, to confront their own biases, and to commit to a higher standard of fairness. Sarah spoke of the countless letters and emails she had received from judges across the nation, men and women who had read her paper and had been inspired to make changes in their own courtrooms. Some had introduced new procedures to ensure that every defendant had the opportunity to be fully heard. Others had begun working with bias training programs to better understand the prejudices that could influence their decisions. Her work had sparked a movement, one that aimed to bring the ideal of blind justice closer to reality. As the seminar drew to a close, Sarah looked out over the audience, her heart swelling with a sense of hope. She had dedicated her life to the pursuit of justice, and though the road had been far from easy, moments like this reminded her that the journey was worth it. She had seen the worst that the justice system had to offer, cases marred by prejudice, by corruption, by the failings of those who wielded power without compassion. But she had also seen the best, the moments of grace, of courage, of people willing to change, to be better, to serve justice with all their hearts. Judge Harrison stepped up to stand beside her once more as the seminar ended, and the room erupted in applause. It was not just for Sarah, or for Harrison, it was for the ideal of justice they both stood for. It was for the hope that the law could be more than just a set of rules, that it could be a force for good, a beacon of fairness and equality. After the applause died down, students began to approach the podium, eager to ask questions, to share their thoughts, to seek guidance. Sarah and Harrison both took their time, speaking to each student, answering their questions with care. It was in these small, personal exchanges that the true impact of their message could be seen, the way the students' eyes lit up, the way they spoke with conviction. They were inspired, ready to take on the challenge of making the justice system better, more compassionate. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Sarah and Harrison walked out of the lecture hall together. The sun was setting over the Georgetown campus, casting a golden glow over the buildings. They walked in silence for a moment, both reflecting on the day's events, on how far they had come. "You know," Harrison said, breaking the silence, "I never imagined that a parking ticket would change my life." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Sarah smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Life has a funny way of teaching us the lessons we need, doesn't it?" she replied. "It's not about where we start, Michael. It's about where we're willing to go, how we're willing to grow." He nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "Thank you, Professor Bennett," he said quietly. "For everything." She looked at him, her expression filled with warmth. "It's Sarah," she corrected gently. "And you're most welcome." They continued walking, the path ahead of them bathed in the soft glow of twilight, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there was always light to guide the way forward. Back in the courthouse, Judge Harrison's courtroom operated with a newfound sense of purpose. It was evident to everyone who stepped inside that something had fundamentally changed. The cold, detached authority that had once defined Harrison's demeanor had been replaced by a quiet, compassionate strength. Defendants were given the time they needed to explain their circumstances, their stories were heard, and their voices mattered. Evidence was considered thoroughly, not just as a matter of procedure, but as an important aspect of uncovering the truth. Each case was approached with an understanding that behind every violation, every infraction, was a human being with a complex story. Lawyers who had once dreaded stepping into his courtroom now found themselves respecting Judge Harrison for the transformation he had undergone. His commitment to fairness was palpable, and the fear of an arbitrary judgment had been replaced with a sense of reassurance that their clients would receive a fair hearing. Harrison's courtroom became a place where people felt seen, where they felt that justice was not just about punishment but about understanding, empathy, and restoration. One notable case involved a young man named Marcus, who had been charged with driving under the influence. In the past, Harrison might have handed down a swift sentence without a second thought. But now, he listened as Marcus spoke, nervous, his voice trembling, about how he had recently lost his mother and had made a terrible mistake trying to cope with the pain. Harrison took in every word, considering not only the severity of the crime but also the story of the young man who stood before him. Instead of a harsh sentence, Harrison chose a path of rehabilitation, requiring Marcus to attend counseling and support groups. It was a decision that not only upheld the law but also gave Marcus the opportunity to change his life for the better. The change in Harrison's courtroom did not go unnoticed. Word spread throughout the courthouse, and beyond, of the judge who had embraced humility and empathy. His courtroom became a model of how justice could be administered with compassion, and soon, other judges began to take notice. Conversations began to shift. What if more courtrooms operated with this same understanding? What if justice truly meant more than punishment? Harrison knew that his journey was far from over, but he was grateful to have found a path that aligned with the ideals that had once inspired him to enter law in the first place. The relationship between Sarah and Michael also evolved in these months. What had once been a strictly teacher-student dynamic grew into one of deep mutual respect and collaboration. Sarah continued her work at Georgetown, and she often invited Michael to speak to her classes, sharing his journey with future lawyers and judges. Together, they worked on initiatives to address racial disparities in minor court cases, advocating for systemic changes that would ensure fair treatment for all. They hosted workshops, seminars, and training sessions for legal professionals, focusing on recognizing and mitigating bias in judicial decisions. Sarah admired the changes she saw in Michael, not just in his courtroom demeanor, but in the way he approached every aspect of his life with a renewed commitment to fairness and empathy. Michael, in turn, felt immense gratitude for Sarah's unwavering support and guidance. She had seen potential in him even when he had lost sight of it himself, and now, as colleagues, they were making a tangible difference together. One rainy afternoon, after giving a lecture to a group of Georgetown law students, Sarah and Michael sat in the empty lecture hall, sipping coffee. They spoke about the progress they had made, the challenges that still lay ahead, and the cases that had left a lasting impact on them. "You know," Michael said, a reflective smile crossing his face, "I never imagined that a simple traffic case would change my entire perspective on justice." Sarah chuckled softly, nodding. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? It's those moments that catch us off guard that often end up teaching us the most important lessons." Michael looked at his mentor, now his colleague and friend, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. He had once been the young judge eager to prove himself, to wield authority without understanding the full weight of his power. Now, he understood that true justice required more than just knowledge of the law. It required heart, humility, and the courage to grow. As we conclude this incredible story, remember that the pursuit of justice is a lifelong journey. Mistakes are inevitable, and we all have moments when we fall short of our ideals. But what truly defines us is how we respond to those moments, how we learn, how we change, and how we strive to be better each day. Judge Harrison's story is a reminder that growth is always possible, that empathy is not a weakness but a strength, and that the real purpose of the law is not just to punish, but to uplift and restore. Justice, at its core, is about people, about their stories, their struggles, and their potential to change. Thank you for watching today's story on Life Story 999. We hope it inspired you to think about fairness, empathy, and how we can all contribute to a more just world. What would you do if you found yourself in Judge Harrison's shoes? How would you handle the responsibility of ensuring justice while balancing empathy? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please share them in the comments below. And if you have a story that has inspired you, a moment where you learned an important lesson about justice or compassion, we'd love to hear it. Please send it our way, and who knows, your story might just be featured in one of our future videos. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an inspiring story. Until next time, stay compassionate, stay fair, and always seek justice. The journey is never over, but every step we take toward understanding and empathy makes a difference.